Hey everyone, welcome back to my studying. Today I have decided to do something different again, which is to go through a memory lane of some of my favorite YA or young adult novels that kind of shaped me as a reader. I'm no longer a YA reader at all. And even when I was, which was a long time ago, YA wasn't really what it is now. YA wasn't a thing. It sort of became a synonymous with tropes instead of just being a age bracket for readers. It's a similar thing with indie music, right? You had indie bands or indie music, which just literally meant that it's music which is published independently and has no publisher, and it can be from any genre. It can be rock, it can be hip hop, it can be anything you like, right? Then with time, indie music became garage alternative rock bands which dress differently and act differently than typical rock stars and have certain sounds and lyricisms that are attributed to them. So from something that's just this umbrella term, it became something very specific, and the same thing happened to YA. At first it was just a marketing bracket, a selling bracket where, these are middle grade books, which are books for middle graders. Then when you graduate from those as a reader, you go to YA books, which are books of any kind that are written for your appropriate age. And now YA is this very, for the most part, very formulaic, very specific, just like with indie music. It's no longer just books written for teenagers. Now it's very often than not chosen one, boy or a girl, in a love triangle, usually very bland, so that person, a reader reading it, can insert themselves easily into the story. And as an aside, there's nothing wrong with wish fulfillment. I just don't enjoy it. My point being is, it's now very formulaic, but I don't think it used to be that way. And I just wanted to go through 5 books that I guess would be classified as YA nowadays, but when I read them just because I found them in a library on a whim, and they became one of my favorites. So first one today is called Sea of Trolls by Nancy Farmer, and it was first published in 2004. And it's actually funny because while writing this, it never occurred to me how much of a Nancy Farmer as a kid I was, because Sea of Trolls is a book that really shaped my love for mythology and retellings of mythology and Viking settings specifically. So this book kind of combines historical fiction with usual fantasy. But what I like about it is the main character is a bard's apprentice, and he lives in a village. And his village is invaded, and he is kidnapped and kept as a slave. And the way he survives his captivity, he is by being a bard, a magical bard, and trying to become useful to the Vikings so that he can find a way to free himself. And as a result, he kind of befriends would be the wrong word because he is, a slave, but he goes on this magical quest with the Vikings into Jotunheim to retrieve something. And I'm not gonna spoil anything, but the reason why this book stayed with me is because the main character is not destined to become a great warrior. He is quite the opposite. Actually, it's a good example of a character being strong as a person, but not necessarily physically. He's a great wordsmith and a poet, and of course a magician of sorts, but he's not defined by his by his physical strength or lack of. And another major character, a girl, actually is the one who has all of the traditional tough warrior traits in the book. And it always struck me, I reread it several times. I just now found out that it has sequels, as a lot of the books on this list. I had no idea. Maybe I'll read them at some point. Maybe I should. But when I read them, I didn't read them in English. I read them as a translation from Croatian, and to Croatian rather, and it stuck with me, which is why I read another book by Nancy Farmer, which is the next on my list, and that is The House of the Scorpion, and it was first published in 2002, I believe. And this one is not fantasy or myth retelling. This one is in the near-ish future, I guess. It's set something like 100 years in the future, in the 22nd century. And there is this Mexican camp of sorts. There is this drug lord who has a clone, and the main character is a boy named Matt, and he is a clone of a drug lord, of a ruler actually, of that whole stretch of land. And he is kind of coming to terms with being a clone, living in this oppressive world, just trying to come to terms with who he is. And living there, he learns about the history of the land and the people, and he makes a terrible realization about, not even about his clone status. He knows this, but a mild spoiler, he discovers that he was never been intended to replace his originator, but rather just to be a living repository of spare organs, which is a very dark theme for a not children's book, but a teenager's book. And looks like, as I said, I was a big Nancy Farmer fan at the time, without even knowing it, because at the time, I admit, I was sort of a reader who didn't very much care or remember writers' names at the time. Like, I was a huge Dune fan, for example. It's my favorite book series, my favorite book of all time. And I knew who Frank Herbert was, and a handful of others. But outside of that, my kind of goal while going to the library was just walking through the aisles and grabbing whatever struck my fancy. And again, as with the last book, I had no idea that there are sequels to this book, so maybe I'll change that. But I like this one because it delivered a rather high concept of morality and ethics to, at the time, probably 12-year-old me. And it did that without being either condescending or patronizing, or just being delivered to me at too high of a level at that time. It was just perfect for my worldviews and I guess the point of my development as a reader at that time. And next book that I would like to kind of talk about is Hatchet by Gary Paulson. It was originally written in 1987. I think this is probably one of the prominent YA books of all time. I believe there were several TV movie adaptations. I haven't seen either. I only read the first one. Again, had no idea that there were sequels. So what's Hatchet about? Hatchet is a story that centers around a 13-year-old boy named Brian, and his parents are divorced and they live really far apart. And the way it works is he gets to visit his father on summers. He lives with his father during summertime, and to do that he boards a plane, a small plane with just him and a pilot. And his mother, before he leaves, gives him a hatchet as a present, because he's going to live in the wilderness for the entire summer, and she thinks that working with hands and bonding with his father might do him well. So the plane he boards crashes somewhere in the Canadian wilderness because the pilot gets a heart attack and dies, and the rest of the novel is Brian trying to survive both mentally and just on a basic survival level. The reason why it struck with me is it caught my attention because at that young of an age, it made me realize how much I like the narrative of man versus nature, or in this case, boy versus nature. It was kind of my gateway drug into survival stories, and maybe by lesser extension into post-apocalyptic fiction, which I talk plenty about. It was a kind of a formative book for me, and do tell me if anyone else was impacted by it as much as I was. And the next book I would like to talk about is probably the most famous on my list, which is the series of His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. I think it probably needs no introduction, but I'll do a short one anyway. So there is this character of Lyra, which lives in this alternative steampunky or maybe gas lampy, whatever you want to call it, this alternative late 19th century world where every person has a living extension of their soul as a familiar of sorts called demon. And she is kind of brought into this huge conspiracy which involves gods, it involves intelligent sentient polar bears, all kinds of stuff, and alternative parallel worlds. And it was just a great trilogy of books. I haven't read the sequels yet. They have recently started to come out, but they were kind of also a great impact on myself. Another book that I would like to talk about is actually a series of books called, of course, Artemis Fowl by Owen Colfer. I believe that's how you pronounce his first name. He's Irish. So despite my negative reaction to his newest book, which was High Fire, and it was his first adult book, I really didn't like that one, but I did at certain point in time greatly enjoy Artemis Fowl series. It started as this clever middle grade story that kind of grew with its audience, and it became a really solid YA series of books. It started as middle grade, evolved into YA, and the reason why I liked it is because it has this smart-ass boy protagonist, which, it spoke to me as a young lad, as a wee lad, and it actually has a somewhat of a twist where the Artemis is not this morally white, clear protagonist in the series. He's actually a criminal mastermind. He's like a boy Bond villain. if that makes sense. And it kind of moves away from that as the books come and go. But the initial concept was always that he is an heir to a criminal empire by his missing father, who is, a mob boss, and he works tirelessly as a young boy to expand his father's empire in his absence, to find his empire, find his father, and so on. And the last series of books I would like to talk about is probably my favorite on the list, and it's called Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, and it was written by Ted Williams. And there are actually 2 series right now, and I haven't read the sequels, which I should, but this is a series I read and read and read. Probably this was my go-to series for rereading before I discovered A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin in my late teens. And I reread it several times. It was probably the series I read the most, apart from like Dune. So it's on the paper, it is somewhat traditional, from rags to riches, chosen peasant boy with noble origins becomes king and all that. But the side characters, the prose, the flavor of it all added to this very flowing, very charming tale that I read and reread over and over again. One of the reasons I also like it is because it's not saccharine, you could read it as an adult and still get something out of it, which I did. I read it in my early 20s. I'm almost 30 now. It still has a lot of stakes that matter, and it's just a good series of books, So that's about it from me today. Do tell me in the comments what were YA books that made an impact on you. I omitted, as the title goes, Harry Potter series, because I think that's sort of a generational thing. We all went through Harry Potter phase. It was kind of unavoidable. It was also a series that I read and reread. But I moved on from Harry Potter a long time ago, and I just don't have much fondness for it anymore. But if you do, that's also cool. And that's apart from the whole controversy about J.K. Rowling and all that stuff. I just, in general, stopped caring about it some time ago. But yeah, which is to say, YA books aren't evil. I don't like them anymore, for the most part, but I will give them a chance every now and then. I'm kind of tired of coming-of-age stories in general, and I tend to avoid the formula. But there's nothing inherently wrong with it. So with that being said, thank you everyone for watching, especially to my Patreon supporters, Kate and Ethan. And see you next time. Bye-bye.